Preflop table dynamics. What table mood means online. Table dynamics. Preflop is the live feedback loop between open frequency, 3-bet frequency, squeeze frequency, and post-flop follow-through. You are not feeling vibes, but you are estimating distributions, then choosing lines with higher expected value. In online pools, the mood is measurable, especially if you multi-table and use tracking software. First, aggression level, how often the pool attires with 3 bets and squeezes. Second, participation level, how wide the opens and calls are, especially from the blinds. Third, discipline level, how often players fold to 3 bets and fold blinds. Fourth, rake drag sensitivity, how much thin pre-flop calling is punished at your stake. Your goal is to label the table fast, then change your range construction. That means knowing when your range should be linear versus polarized ranges. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit. Quantify the table with open 3-bet, fold to 3-bet, and squeeze stats. Then widen or tighten aggressively. Second, the risk. Overreacting to small sample sizes, especially while multi-tabling. Third, the counter. Recalibrate every orbit. Use position-based notes when data conflicts with showdowns. The pre-flop dynamics hierarchy. Pre-flop table mood is driven by the most aggressive player, not the average player. One high-frequency 3-better in the blinds can suppress opens for the entire table. Build your mental model in this order because each layer constrains the next. First, blinds, do they 3-bet, cold call, or overfold? Second, late position opens, do cutoff and button steal wide or stay tight? Third, middle position, do players open too wide and hate facing 3 bets? Fourth, early position, do they protect or do they open capped ranges? Fifth, short stacks, do they reduce squeeze risk or create jam incentives? When the blinds are passive, your button and cutoff opens realize more equity. That is equity realization, R. You keep more of your raw equity because you see flops cheaply and in position. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit. Attack passive blinds with wider steals and smaller opens. Force them into low expected value calls under rake drag. Second, the risk. Autopiloting wide opens into a formation that starts squeezing. Third, the counter. If squeezes appear, tighten opens and add more 4-bet bluffs with correct blockers. 4 table archetypes you must recognize. You need labels that translate directly into range selection. Use these 4. They cover most online pool configurations. First, passive call station table, wide calls, low 3-bet, low squeeze. Second, night trap table, tight opens, low VPIP, sudden strong 3-bets. Third, 3-bet war table, high 3-bet from blinds, frequent squeezes. Fourth, loose spew table, wide opens, wide 3-bets, post-flop punts. Each archetype changes your incentive to go linear versus polarized ranges. Against heavy 3-bet pressure, you polarize more in position and defend tighter out of position. Against passive fields, you go more linear and value dense. The poker place. Exploit framework. First, the exploit. Categorize quickly, then lock to the corresponding preflop plan. Do not mix strategies randomly. Second, the risk. Mislabeling the table because you saw one showdown. Third, the counter. Update the label when frequencies shift, especially after seats change. Range design based on aggression. Table aggression determines what hands keep expected value when facing heat. Your pre-flop ranges should be built around playability and blockers, not hope. Stop set mining or flatting because it is suited, without the odds and position. First, in low aggression games, open wider with playable hands like 8-7 suited and King-Jack offsuit. Second, in high aggression games, tighten your opens, then add 4-bet bluffs using blockers and unblockers. Third, when players cold call too much, your 3-bet range should go more linear versus polarized ranges, value heavy. Capped versus uncapped is your core concept here. If you flat the button versus a strong small blind 3-bet, your range is often capped. Their range stays uncapped. That gap matters immediately, post-flop, and it starts pre-flop with disciplined selection. the poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit versus high aggression, cut marginal opens, defend with hands that realize equity, and 4-bet with blockers. Second, the risk, overfolding, which lets good regulars print with any 2 cards. Third, the counter. If the table starts over bluffing, widen your 3-bet call range with hands that dominate their bluffs. MDF thinking pre-flop, defending versus steals and 3-bets. Minimum defense frequency, MDF, is not only a post-flop tool. Pre-flop. It tells you when your folding becomes exploitable to constant steals or 3-bets. You do not defend because you are annoyed. You defend because folding is negative expected value. First, if button opens too wide and you overfold big blind, they print auto profit. Second, if blinds 3-bet too often and you fold every marginal open, they tax your entire opening strategy. But MDF is constrained by rake. In many online pools, defending too wide in the blinds under rake drag is a mistake. Your defense must still have reasonable equity realization, R, the poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit. Defend enough to stop auto profit, then select hands with strong realization. Avoid dominated offsuit trash. Second, the risk, using MDF as an excuse to call too wide from the blinds into high rake. Third, the counter. If villains adjust by tightening steals, you can reduce defense and shift to more 3-bet focused responses. In position plan, cutoff and button versus big blind. Your easiest expected value comes from position. That is where you can scale opens and punish passive blinds. Against a low 3-bet big blind, you can open wider and use smaller sizings to increase immediate profit. Against an aggressive big blind, you should open tighter and shift to a range that can 4-bet or call 3-bets profitably. First, versus passive big blind, open more hands like 8-7 suited, king-jack offsuit, and pocket 4s. Second, versus high 3-bet big blind, cut hands that realize poorly. Reduce offsuit Broadway without dominance. Third, use 4-bet bluffs with strong blockers and unblockers. Examples include ace-5 suited through ace, 2 suited, and king-5 suited through king-4 suited. Fourth, when big blind cold calls too wide, 3-bet less is irrelevant here. You should value open more and expect higher realization post-flop. You are managing 2 outcomes, denying the big blind their realization and maximizing yours. Your range wants to stay less capped versus uncapped than the big blind, so you can apply pressure on high card boards. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit. Widen steals versus overfolding blinds. Tighten and add blocker 4-bets versus aggressive blinds. Second, the risk, opening wide without a plan, then making hope-based calls versus 3-bets. Third, the counter. If big blind stops 3-betting and starts calling, shift to larger opens and value-dense post-flop lines. Out-of-position problems, small blind and big blind versus late position. Out of position, your equity realization, R, drops. That forces tighter calls and more 3-betting. Your small blind, cold call range should be extremely disciplined. Rake drag destroys weak flats. Build a plan that uses aggression, not passive hope. Poker. First, from small blind versus button, prefer 3-betting a linear value range like pocket 10s and better and ace-queen suited through ace-jack suited. Second, add a polarized component with blocker bluffs like ace-5 suited through ace-2 suited when button overfolds to 3-bets. Third, be careful flatting hands like king-jack offsuit in small blind. You invite domination and low realization. Fourth, from big blind, defend more than small blind because you close action. Still prioritize suited and connected hands. When button is wide and folds too much to 3-bets, you're small blind. 3-bet prints immediately. When button is sticky and in position, you need a more linear 3-bet range with hands that can barrel for value. The poker place. Exploit framework. First, the exploit. Use more 3-bets from small blind. Avoid weak flats. build linear value plus blocker bluffs when fold equity exists. Second, the risk, over 3-betting versus opponents who defend correctly, creating low expected value pots out of position. Third, the counter. If villains start 4-betting more, tighten bluffs and call more. 3 bets in position when available. Multi-way dynamics, who enters pots changes everything. Multi-way pre-flop is its own game. Your fold equity collapses and your realization changes. When there is a raise and a call, the caller is often capped versus uncapped and contains many medium-strength hands. That creates squeeze opportunities. It also creates traps when the opener is strong. First, if an EP player opens and MP calls, your squeeze range should be tighter and more value dense. Second, if cutoff opens wide and button cold calls wide, your small blind or big blind squeeze can go more polarized. Third, hands like pocket fours do not auto-set mine. You need stacks, implied odds, and a realistic path to realize. Online, multi-way pots amplify rake drag. Thin calls become immediate leaks. Prefer aggressive isolation or tight folds, not passive see a flop decisions. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit. Squeeze capped callers, isolate weak players, and remove rake punished flats from your game. Second, the risk. Squeezing into an uncapped opener who 4-bets correctly. Third, the counter. If openers respond by trapping, reduce bluffs and keep squeezes value heavy. Scenario application, turn the mood into expected value. Scenario box. Hero. Hand, 8 of spades, 7 of spades. Flop, King of clubs, 9 of hearts, 2 of spades. Action, hero opens button, big blind calls, big blind checks. Table has been low 3-bet, high, big blind call frequency. Your pre-flop decision was driven by table mood. Passive, big blind means higher equity realization. R. Now post-flop, your range is wide and big blind is capped. You can c-bet frequently with small sizing. If the same table becomes a 3-bet war, opening 8-7 suited becomes lower expected value because realization collapses versus 3 bets. The poker place. Exploit framework. First, the exploit. When big blind is passive and capped, steal wider and apply range pressure post-flop. Second, the risk. If you keep opening wide when big blind starts 3-betting, you bleed expected value via forced folds. Third, the counter. If big blind adjusts with more 3-bets, tighten opens and 4-bet with blocker hands. Pre-flop operating rules for online pools. When you have multiple tables open, you need rules that survive distraction. Use heuristics tied to expected value, not feelings. First, if blinds fold too much, increase steals and reduce limping to 0. Second, if blinds 3-bet aggressively, tighten opens and keep a 4-bet bluff set using blockers and unblockers. Third, if cold calls are high, go more linear with 3-bets and value isolate thinner. Fourth, if rake is high, cut marginal pre-flop calls, especially from small blind. Fifth, if you are unsure, default to tight aggressive rather than passive hope. Poker. The poker place. Exploit framework. First, the exploit. Build stable defaults, then deviate only when you have clear frequency evidence. Second, the risk. Overfitting to HUD stats without context, sample size, or lineup changes. Third, the counter. When opponents adapt, move back toward theory and protect your opening frequency. Key takeaway. The Poker Place Academy. Pre-flop table dynamics is range design under pressure. You label the table by aggression and participation, then choose linear versus polarized ranges that maximize expected value. You defend enough to avoid getting exploited, but only with hands that keep equity realization, R, under rake drag. You avoid hope-based flats. You stay aware of capped versus uncapped structures. You use blockers and unblockers to build credible 4-bet lines, and you anchor your defense to minimum defense frequency, MDF, without lighting money on fire. Now, let's test your edge. Question 1. What does table mood mean online according to the article? Answer. A measurable feedback loop between open frequency, 3-bet frequency, squeeze frequency, and post-flop follow-through. Explanation. The article emphasizes you are estimating distributions, using frequencies, not relying on vibes, then choosing higher expected value lines. Question 2. In the pre-flop dynamics hierarchy, which player type is said to drive table mood more than the average player? Answer. The most aggressive player. Explanation. The article states one high-frequency 3-better, especially in the blinds, can suppress opens for the entire table. Question 3. Name the 4 table archetypes the article says you must recognize. Answer. Passive call station table, nit trap table, 3-bet war table, loose spew table. Explanation. These labels are meant to translate directly into pre-flop range selection and linear versus polarized incentives. Question 4. Why does the article say MDF thinking pre-flop is constrained in many online pools? Answer. Because rake drag can make defending too wide in the blinds a mistake. Explanation. The article notes you must still choose hands with reasonable equity realization, not defend everything just to meet MDF. Question 5. According to the article, what is the exploit adjustment if squeezes begin appearing after you've been opening wide into passive blinds? Answer. Tighten opens and add more 4-bet bluffs with correct blockers. Explanation. The article warns against autopiloting wide steals once the table formation shifts toward squeezing and higher pre-flop pressure. Study hard, play smart. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next lesson.